What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Today let's talk about the complex dynamics surrounding the war in Ukraine, particularly the recent developments that allowed Western countries to provide increasingly advanced military support to Ukraine and cross Putin's so-called red lines. This shift in strategy marks a significant moment in global geopolitics, as it reflects the West's growing willingness to challenge Russia directly, despite its nuclear threats, which, let's be honest, are no longer Putin's powerful blackmail tool, as we already discussed previously. The most ironic part about all this is that it was Putin himself who diminished and destroyed all the nuclear potential of his own country. He did it by threatening the world with unforgettable consequences multiple times and, thankfully, never fulfilling his promises. Most of you know the story of the boy who cried wolves. Well, as you can see, we have a real-world example on a much grander scale. And no matter how big is the lie or the blackmail, eventually people stop taking the liar seriously. To understand why the West has become more open to supporting Ukraine's military offensives deep into Russian territory, we need to consider the evolution of Western aid since the beginning of the conflict. At first, Western nations were reluctant to provide Ukraine with heavy weapons, fearing that doing so would provoke a dangerous escalation with Russia. The howitzer guns were among the earliest pieces of equipment delivered, and even those were sent with a significant hesitation. Over time, as the conflict dragged on and Russia's aggression showed no signs of easing, the West began to shift its stance. An arrival of HIMARS and ATACMS changed the game completely. It allowed Ukrainians to push Russians further from the front lines and recapture significant territories. Patriot air defense systems are now protecting major Ukrainian cities, not allowing even the most sophisticated Russian missiles to go through. And Abrams, Leopard tanks, and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, for example, are providing massive support to Ukrainian infantry in ground operations. All this was unthinkable at the beginning of the conflict, because the West was afraid to enrage Putin, who was rattling his nuclear saber daily. Slowly but surely, as more Putin's threats ended up being simple blackmail, the West started to increase the military support to Ukraine, testing the edges of so-called red or maybe even brown lines. After almost every type of military equipment reached Ukraine with no harsh reaction by Putin, the West started debating whether they should allow Ukraine to attack the territory of Russia, bringing the conflict outside of Ukrainian borders. At first, US and European officials were quickly to deny any suggestions that they would authorize Ukraine to use their weapons against Russian land. But this pattern of initial denial, followed by gradual approval, has been a consistent trend. Some may say that the denial was actually the confirmation that the conversations and the debates have already started. For example, after US President Joe Biden stated that Ukraine would not be permitted to use American-made weapons on Russian soil, then the United Kingdom soon allowed Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles for precisely this purpose. This decision was likely coordinated with the US, since some of the components of the Storm Shadow are American-made, and Americans obviously were probably hesitant for Russians gaining access to this technology. This was yet another test of Putin's red lines and how far the West can go. This also indicated a growing consensus that more aggressive support for Ukraine was necessary. The situation took a more decisive turn when Russia began to purchase missiles from Iran. This act of desperation on Russia's part, combined with its continuous brutal assaults on Ukrainian civilians, pushed the West to approve even more offensive measures. The decision to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia became inevitable, so as the West recognized that holding back was no longer a viable option. The US now appears likely to greenlight the use of ATACMS long-range missiles, further expanding Ukraine's offensive capabilities. And just like with the arrival of HIMARS in the beginning of the conflict, this can, and most likely will, drastically change the course of war. As Ukraine continues to receive more advanced military aid, the Russian government has struggled to maintain the narrative that it is still in control of the situation. The Kremlin's response to these developments has been relatively muted. But at the same time, the capture of small, abandoned villages still makes the prime-time news. When the West first started supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles, Russian officials, including spokesperson of Kremlin Dmitry Peskov, mostly declined to comment. Even when Putin finally addressed the issue himself, his remarks were vague and non-committal. He acknowledged NATO's involvement, but surprisingly, did not make any concrete threats or announced significant retribution steps. Is he finally learning that multiple nuclear threats per week eventually stop working? Or is he trying to weaken people's perception to his blackmail just to start his nuclear threats once again in the future from blank state? However, his reaction is indicative of a broader reality. Putin's ability to escalate the conflict further is severely limited. His blackmail no longer works as well. Despite his previous threats, it seems that even Putin's most loyal advisors have grown tired of his saber rattling. Over time, the West also realized that Putin's threats of escalation, particularly regarding the use of nuclear weapons, are largely empty. The fact that Putin can no longer escalate the war without facing significant risks to his own regime is a critical factor in the West's decision to provide Ukraine with more powerful weapons. After all, which choice he has left? Another mobilization? Well, this will immediately let the people of Russia know that the war is not going according to the plan, that the reality is grim, and that the state propaganda on TV severely exaggerates the things. Another Putin's choice is to increase the financial incentives to sign up more contract soldiers and mercenaries. But as we talked in one of previous videos, the cost of each new soldier goes exponentially higher. Whoever wanted to sign the contract for $20,000 already did it. Offering more money will not bring significantly more people. It will just stretch the Russian resources even thinner. The financial situation will destabilize, causing the population to become even more poor. And those people who don't care much about the war will most certainly care about the rising costs of groceries, utilities, and rent. So no matter how much Putin wants to escalate the situation to gain some political points inside the country, he will not be able to do it without significant threat to his regime. Putin's own rhetoric started to undermine the image he spent years building. For much of his time in power, Putin projected the image of strength and invincibility, often using threats and intimidation to get his way on the global stage and inside Russia. But as the conflict in Ukraine drags on, it became clear that Russia's military might is not as powerful as once believed. The myth of Russia's military superiority, carefully constructed by Putin's regime, is slowly collapsing. It used to be the second strongest military in the world. Now it is barely the second military in Ukraine. And if you think about it, maybe not even the second strongest army in Russia itself. Yes, Putin's inability to escalate the war any further has exposed the limits of his power. But it also revealed a more alarming possibility: the threat of new wars emerging in other parts of the world. Putin's war in Ukraine has shown other dictators that it is possible to engage in acts of aggression with minimal consequences. This raises the risk of similar conflicts erupting elsewhere, as other autocratic leaders may feel motivated by Putin's initial successes and lack of meaningful responses from other countries. So countries like North Korea, for example, which are already isolated and don't care much about more Western sanctions, have literally nothing to lose. They can attack their neighboring countries with little fear of dramatic consequences. If the world does not care about stopping Putin himself, who would care about a country 10 times smaller in size and 100 times smaller in political influence? Western leaders understand this as well. As a result, they have become more willing to take risks in order to ensure that Ukraine does not collapse. The steady flow of military aid, including long-range missiles and other advanced weapons, is a clear indication that the West is committed to preventing Putin from achieving his objectives. The goal is to make the war as costly and as unsustainable for Russia as possible, forcing Putin to the negotiations table, or at the very least preventing him from declaring any sort of victory. By supporting Ukraine's efforts to push back against Russian aggression, the West is sending a message to other potential aggressors that such actions will not be tolerated. Well, there you have it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support my work, there are links down below, PayPal donations, Patreon memberships for bonus content, and also you can buy the Russian Dude merch. All the links are down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.